My name is Masha Pearl, Executive Director of the Blue Card, the only organization in the United States with the sole mission of assisting Holocaust survivors. I welcome you to the latest episode of Stories of the Holocaust, Overcoming Historical Trauma. With us today is renowned historical trauma psychologist based in New York City, Dr. Eva Fogelman. Joining Dr. Fogelman and I today is Miss Suzanne Bennet. Born in 1938, Suzanne Klejman was the daughter of art and antiques dealers in Warsaw, Poland. Suzanne will share her incredible story of escape and survival. It is a pleasure to have Suzanne here with us today. I would like to now open it up for a discussion with Dr. Fogelman and Suzanne Bennet. Thank you both.
Welcome, Suzanne, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for the Blue Card podcast. And today is sort of a very difficult day for all of us, and I'm sure probably for you as well, with Russia invading the Ukraine and the war memories that might be being brought up for you if you're watching any TV.
Yes, it is. I found it very, very difficult during the Bosnian War and extremely upsetting because it just brought everything back, and I'm afraid it's going to happen again.
My recommendation, particularly to Holocaust survivors, is to stay away from television and to have all those images brought back because it could bring back all the old memories of the war. So, if possible, I recommend not to watch any television. So, I'd like to begin with you were born a year before the war and went into the ghetto 2 years of age. I'd like to begin by just asking a little bit if you can tell us about your family. Your father's family had been in Warsaw since the 1800s. They came from Holland, and I assume before that they must have come from Spain after the expulsion from Spain. Your mother's family had come from Lithuania. And tell us a little bit about what your family was like and lived in Poland for so many years.
On my father's side, as far as I know, they were mostly flour merchants and had flour mills. On my mother's side, they were furriers, which was a common Jewish occupation. They were both educated abroad because there was a quota at the university in Warsaw. My father wanted to study medicine, so he first went to Rouen and then to Paris. My mother went to Lausanne to study pharmacology. And my various uncles and so forth actually studied engineering and also medicine in Germany. That was really very common in the educated classes, Jewish families in Warsaw, because there was no other choice. But it also meant that they had a wide knowledge of languages, European languages, and also friends all over Europe.
And what did your father and mother do in Warsaw before you were born?
My father was a well-known, apparently, antiquities dealer. They never really spoke about it very much, but I came across a PhD that someone had written on the internet the other day about the art market in Poland before the war. And he mentioned that my father was one of the two major antiquities dealers in Warsaw. And fortunately for them, fortunately, as it turned out after the war, they had a very, their clientele consisted of many foreign diplomats, as well as Polish upper class collectors and so forth. And quite a few of them were able to help them after the war when they were left with nothing.
And what happened to the gallery and some of the artwork? Were they able
They
to
were both
give it
blown up.
back after the war?
They were both blown up early in the war. But the wife of the Polish of the president of Poland actually um, had taken some of their paintings, rolled up oil paintings, Dutch paintings, to from an exhibition which was being held at the palace, and returned them after the war.
Oh, that's beautiful.
My daughter has several of them still. And a couple of other people had taken some other artworks and so forth on their way out of Poland. They were, again, diplomats, and returned them after the war. But the gallery and their house were both blown up.
So both your mother and your father had large families before the war, and then you were all put into the Warsaw Ghetto. And what are some of your early memories from the Warsaw Ghetto, living together with your extended family in such a small space?
We were living mostly with my mother's grandmother's family. Her brothers were living in another part of the ghetto with their children. They had about 6 teenage children, 2 babies. We had my grandmother, my 2 of my aunts, the mother-in-law of one of my mother's brothers. So, but we were very fortunate in that my father had traded his house, when it still existed, for a duplex apartment in a building in the ghetto with a friend, an artist, who had to move because he was a Polish Catholic. But so we had space actually, because no one else did at that point.
Yeah.
Sadly, my maternal grandmother would go every day to visit her brothers in another part of the ghetto, and one day simply didn't come back. We don't know what happened.
Wow. Wow. I'm sure your mother probably never got over that.
She didn't. And other than that, as you know, as it began, you remember things from your childhood if they are really unusual and not routine,
Right.
I think. And my parents always refused to talk about it. So the few things that I do remember, I try to ask them about, and they would say, yes, that happened or didn't. But what you remember from those days is the bodies in the street, beggars who tried to come in and be helped. I still distinctly remember one man who would come regularly and beg in the building, and the man above us pushed him down the stairs. He was so mad at him one day, and I've always had this absolute thing about staircases with metal rims on the stairs ever since,
Yeah.
because I saw him falling down those stairs. Very, very strange things that you remember.
Yeah. And I'm sure one of the things that happens to Holocaust survivors is as you age, you tend to remember things more from the past, and long-term memory becomes more active than short-term memory.
It definitely happened to my mother, who lived to be almost 100. In the last couple of years of her life, she had Lewy body dementia, which came and went, and she suddenly started to talk about her cousins, whom she had never mentioned before, including one cousin who was 21 and had gone to England to study at Cambridge. But when the war broke out, he came back to be with his family, and of course ended up in the ghetto and ended up murdered at Treblinka. And it was very strange. She never talked about the war until those last few years.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how were you able to escape from the ghetto and survive?
In my case, I was very blonde, platinum blonde actually, and blue-eyed. And a Polish British friend of my parents arranged with a Polish policeman to take me out one day. They realized in 1942, when members of the family started to disappear, what was happening. They had been totally unwilling to really comprehend the horror of it. They had German friends who had warned them before the war that it was going to happen. And like so many other Poles, they couldn't think of the civilized Germans as doing this, even after Kristallnacht, which I've never understood, why that did not make them realize what was happening. And my mother dressed me apparently in a little white coat that she had, which sort of emphasized how Aryan I looked. And the friend picked me up from the policeman the next day, and he said that there was coal dust all over my coat, and he thought he must have been hiding me in a cellar in between. And he took me out to the countryside to a little town called Podkovaleshna, where my nanny lived. And for the next few years, I posed as my nanny's child. And we actually, the cottage we lived in was actually more or less across the street from the local manor house, which was being used as a Gestapo headquarters.
Wow, wow. And how did your mother get out of the ghetto? How did your father get out of the ghetto?
My mother went out regularly with slave labor groups to work in a factory. And one day, the person checking people in and out turned out to be a high school friend of hers, who said to her, "Don't come back, and I'll mark you as having returned." And so my mother found a way to just get away from the group and not come back, and ended up for months living with a group of nuns who were taking in people to help, and who eventually were themselves rounded up and taken to the Umschlagplatz to be put on the trains for Treblinka. But one of the Germans standing there said to the Mother Superior, "Go and talk to the man in charge, because he's a Catholic and maybe he'll help you." And my mother described one of the few stories she told, actually. Actually having her foot on the bottom of the steps going into the train when the Mother Superior came running down the station, waving a piece of paper and saying, "We can go, we can go." And they walked, I think, about 13 miles from there to Podkovaleshna, ended up staying with us in the country for about a week and a half, and then moved on to their head convent, which was in Częstochowa. But I knew enough. I was about 4.5 by then. I knew that I was not supposed to recognize my mother. The nuns were not aware of the fact that she was Jewish or that I was Jewish. One of them had died at one point, and they had given my mother her habit. But somehow, apparently, I did recognize her, but I knew that I shouldn't say anything, and I didn't.
Wow.
Until the nuns had left.
Wow. And then your mother remained with you until the end of the war in that same hiding
She did.
place?
My father did not was not able to get out of the ghetto until the uprising, when he did manage to escape. Um, he hid with various friends. He hid in the basement for a while of the Vedel candy store, which is a very famous candy maker. Still exists, actually, until that basement was bombed. And we did not see him again until the Russians marched into Warsaw at the end of the war.
And do you remember the day of liberation?
I don't remember the day particularly. I remember my father suddenly being there.
And had you remembered him?
No,
You didn't remember him.
I didn't.
That must have been very difficult for him.
I don't know. He never ever talked about the war. He was very withdrawn. My mother described him as being this, cheerful little kid all his life. They knew each other from the time they were 12 and 13.
Wow.
And married when they were 20. And he was very, very close to his family, and his whole family was killed in 42. We assume they were all taken off to Treblinka. We assume to the gas chambers.
Right.
2 babies, about 8 teenagers, my 2 uncles and their wives. My maternal grandmother, of course, had already disappeared, but my paternal grandmother was still alive at that point, and she also disappeared into Treblinka.
He had a lot of people to mourn, and your mother had a lot of people to mourn.
My mother was close, I think, only really to her mother, and to her uncles. Didn't really know her teenage cousins that much because there was a big gap. I mean, she was in her early 30s and they were still, 8,
Yeah.
9, 12, 13.
Yeah.
But she had been extremely close to her mother, and she spoke about her, but never about what had happened.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about, what, after the 3 of you were together in the countryside, did you go back to Warsaw to try to begin life anew, or what did happen?
We did. We went back. My father reopened the gallery, managed to reassemble some of the things that he had left with friends, Polish Catholic friends around Warsaw that had not been destroyed. Warsaw itself was, of course, pretty much destroyed by the Germans as they left. And he actually had a number of his former diplomatic clients turn up after the war, including a friend who came in as head of the Dutch Red Cross. This man who was the Swedish ambassador, who had been in a different position before the war, but was able to get visas for us to leave Poland and go to Sweden. My parents felt that there was no future in Poland. And my mother has had a story that a very close friend of hers who was Catholic and who had helped them enormously, Janina Kucharska, and they hid my father for a long time, she and her husband, Henrik, was walking in the street when a man came along and shoved her very hard out into the traffic. And he said, "So, old Jewish, you survived the war. Well, we'll get you yet." And Janina went to see my parents and said, "You have to get out. Things are never going to change."
So you then, so you went to Sweden and you had to adjust to a new life in Stockholm. What was that like for you to go from Polish to all of a sudden, have to speak Swedish and a different school system. What was that like for you?
It was actually quite easy. I mean, at that age, you find languages very, very easy to learn. Um, I loved school. We were there for first through fourth grades. And we had an apartment which belonged to the Dutchman from the Red Cross, which he let my parents. So they had a place to live. He happened to own an apartment in Stockholm. And it was actually a very pleasant life. My Swedish was perfect. I mean, so much so that I was interviewed one day on the playground by somebody who thought that I was a typical little Swedish girl. And I still have the clipping from the newspaper about that.
Oh, that's beautiful. And how did you then move to Mexico? I mean, your parents didn't want to continue to stay in Sweden?
No, we traveled quite a bit around Europe as we were waiting to go to Mexico. We were on the quota list for immigrating to the United States, and that took about 5 years. And so the fifth year in Sweden, the same Swedish ambassador who had arranged for us to leave Poland became the ambassador to Mexico. And so he arranged for us to have visas. I mean, we were so lucky. My mother, surviving the war, my mother said, was pure chance, pure luck. Who survived, who did not survive. And because of my parents, again, connections from before the war in the diplomatic corps, we were again incredibly lucky having survived to have people help us.
And again, what was that like for you, from Polish to Swedish and now to Spanish? And now you're already in what, about fourth grade or so?
Yes, well, I went to the American school in Mexico City, and I had to learn English and Spanish at the same time. Yeah. And I took the exam to get in, and I was jumped 3 grades because apparently the schools in Sweden were so far ahead. I never quite caught up in math as a result. I've always had terrible trouble with math. And I still speak Spanish because I've kept it up. My parents also took English lessons while we were there, but I felt that their English was very good. My children felt that they had terrible, thick accents always.
Well, you certainly don't.
I have an accent. It's very strange. Usually people from the American South pick it up and no one else does.
And anything unusual happened to you in Mexico in terms of friends that you made there, or how you were treated in the school there, or?
I don't remember making many friends in the school itself, but my father wanted to study pre-Columbian art. And so we came to know a large group of Mexican, many of them foreign-born archaeologists, Mexican artists. One of our friends was having her portrait painted by Diego Rivera, and so I got to go with her and sit while she was having her portrait painted, and met him and Frida Kahlo.
You met Frida Kahlo?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I actually, if you pardon my saying so, didn't really care for her very much. I thought he was lovely, and I thought she was very rude to him all the time. But you have to remember, I was 11 years old.
Right, so. Right. Well, I think you pick. Kids are very sensitive, and you picked up her personality, I'm sure.
But we traveled a lot around Mexico to all the archaeological sites and so forth. It was absolutely fascinating. And again, languages at that age come very easily. So I translated for my parents when needed.
Wow. And then you moved on to the United States, and you came to New York, and again another transitional period.
We went through Havana actually, and I still remember the wonderful parrots in the marketplace in Havana, and also being horrified on the plane by a peanut butter sandwich. I couldn't understand what that was. We went to a hotel called the Buckingham Hotel in New York, which was in downtown. And again, my English was better than my parents at this point, so I was sent out to. I did all the grocery shopping for the family and so forth, and talking to real estate agents until we found a place to rent, which was on 56th Street near Fifth Avenue. I used to go and buy things, winter coats and makeup at during sales at the various department stores, which my parents sent back to friends in Poland, which I think they probably sold on the black market in order to have some income. In 8th grade at PS 59, my teacher, Berta Lieberman, heard me talking one day about the fact that my father had African art to sell. And her son, Alexander, was a curator. He was actually very well known in future years, was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. No one called it MoMA in those days.
Right.
And he came to see my father and then introduced Nelson Rockefeller and other people to my father. And that's how the gallery took off, thanks to my 8th grade teacher.
Wow. And who were some of the other customers that your father had in the Klejman Gallery?
Over the years, a great many well-known figures, some of whom collected, some of whom didn't. He had many artists who came, like Jacques Lipchitz, for French and British porcelains. He had the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Greta Garbo came a few times, and she wrote a check for $100 for something. I don't know what it was. And I was so thrilled. I asked my father to please not cash the check. We had to have her signature, and he said he couldn't afford not to cash it. And all of the Rockefeller brothers were customers. Later on, through Prince Radziwiłł, whose father and mother my parents had known well before World War II, and who married Jackie Kennedy, the Kennedys came to the gallery, both John and Bobby. It was very much for my parents the way it had been before World War II, in the sense that they were very fortunate in having a wide variety of well-to-do clients, and they were able to. My father was able, after a couple of years, to go to Europe and buy things again, and my mother ran the gallery. My father was always very withdrawn as a result of the war, and she was the one who was sort of the face of the gallery, and he was the one who really knew art.
And were you ever working in the gallery at all, or did you hang around there?
I hung around, especially in the summers. I went to Hunter College High School. Again, I found both PS 59 and Hunter College High School because my parents knew nothing about American schools at all. And we discovered just a very few years ago that there had been a number of Holocaust survivors at my high school. None of us knew about each other. And one of the teachers discovered that she started a website actually where people have put their stories. Most of them, I don't think there was anyone else from Poland. They were from other parts of Eastern Europe. And some of them had been born after the war in the camps, in the displaced person camps. And in the last couple of years, some of us have met over Zoom, actually, not in person. And we've talked about why nobody knew about each other, but it was because nobody wanted to talk about it at all.
It was very common in those days that nobody spoke about it. I think all the communication that began around the Holocaust, I would say, really began more in the mid '80s, and then after, which was after the showing of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, which was on national PBS. And before that, I would say, well, really after 1978, when Gerald Green's Holocaust miniseries was on television, is the first time that people became aware of, gee, what really happened to the Jews. The Ahmed trial, which was a very big experience in Israel for the survivors, for the rest of the community to begin to talk about what happened. But in the United States, it first happened in '77, and then in '85, and then obviously more in recent years. So your experience of not even knowing that there were other people who were children during the Holocaust is very very common in all the other both American schools and certainly Israeli schools as well. And where did you in any way feel different from your American peers? Did you in high school? Did you feel like you don't belong, or how did you feel in high school?
Well, we all wanted to fit in. I think that was one reason we never talked about it. We just wanted to be Americans. Because Hunter was one of the high schools that you had to take an exam to get into. None of us lived in the neighborhood, so we didn't really know each other outside school particularly. And really, I spent most of my time with adults and very little with people my own age until I got to college. And again, I researched colleges because my parents didn't know much about American university life and ended up at Wellesley in the same class as Madeleine Albright. And again, the two of us never spoke about it until years later when we met here in Washington, when our children started the same nursery school.
Wow, wow.
So again, we didn't know about each other's background.
What did you major in Wellesley?
Art history and a minor in Spanish.
Uh-huh.
And then after that, I met my husband when we were juniors in college.
Where did you meet him?
One of my roommates and I had blind dates with two people, and we got to like each other's friends better. And I started to date the young man she was with, and vice versa. And that's where we met, on a blind date. And he went on to eventually to get a master's and a PhD in Russian medieval history, which in the case of Russia is the time of Peter the Great. It's really the 17th century. Before he finished, we went to India for 3 years with the State Department. And by that time, I was having trouble with languages. I did not learn Hindi. Fortunately, in India, it was easy enough to get along with
English.
English. While he was getting his PhD, I went to Simmons College and got a Master's of Science in Library Science because he was planning to teach, and I thought it would be a profession I could take with me wherever he went. But as it turned out, after India, he finished his doctorate and then went into the State Department and was later appointed to various government positions. And he never did in those years teach at all, but I did. I became a librarian. I worked before we left Cambridge, I worked at Harvard for several years as assistant Scandinavian cataloger.
Wow.
Because I did know Swedish very well, and I learned to at least read the other languages enough to be able to catalog cards. And so learning languages was a very useful thing for me. Many years later, after working for many years as a secondary school librarian, I got another master's in art history at the University of Maryland, because by that time I wanted to go back to history of art. So.
And where did you have, when did you have your first child? Where were you living?
We had our two sons in the first one we had in New Delhi when we were there. And the second one I was 7 months pregnant with when we came back to the States, and he was born in Boston. My daughter was born here in Washington.
So who's older, James or Michael?
Michael.
Michael's older.
Michael's the one born in India. And when he ran for public office, there was a real question whether he could run for Senate because he had been born in New Delhi. But as the child of an American diplomat, he automatically had an American citizenship. So.
And then he also ran for president of the United States in the 2020 election.
He had a very brief campaign. Well,
he came in a little late.
He did.
Yeah.
He did. He was ill for a while and he came in rather late. And I'm really I was sort of relieved when it didn't work out. And I think he has done an amazing job in the Senate. He's worked very, very hard on immigrant issues. In the his first years in the Senate, he and three other senators managed to get the Dreamers Act passed, but it then died in the House when the Republicans refused to bring it up for a vote. But it did pass the Senate. And if it had, I think, passed the House, we would not be where we are now on the issues of immigration.
Right. Well, certainly being a child of Holocaust survivors, he was very sensitive to the plight of immigrants, knowing that he came from a family of immigrants who were refugees. And that too is that children of Holocaust survivors, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have a tremendous increase in their empathy, and as a result of their particular family background. And yeah, I mean, how did it feel feeling, here you are, persecuted as a Jew, and you have a son who's living in a free country, who as who can run as president of the United States. Did you ever put the two and two together in terms of thinking about that?
It was absolutely incredible to me. It always was. And I kept thinking that, America is the only place this could happen. It could only happen that somebody who survived the Warsaw Ghetto by the skin of her teeth got to go to the White House when Ford was president, when Clinton was president, when Obama was president, and meet all of these people and be completely accepted. It really is a unique country in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to what was it like for you to be a mother, to give, birth to children? Did it evoke in you any fears about, how to protect your children? Sometimes child survivors like yourself, even second generation, begin to have a little bit of a fear of, will I be able to protect my child if something happens? Did you have any of those feelings as a mother early on?
I always did. I think I've been probably a rather negative person as a result, because I can always see danger around every corner sometimes. My father, for example, when I was small, was unbelievably protective. I mean, he wouldn't let me play on the parallel bars in a playground because he was afraid I would fall. And I think I did that a bit with my children. I and my mother always had to know where everybody was. And I thought pretty much all of the time, every single day, I think, about what had happened to my family. I had a cousin who was 14 when she disappeared, I assume, to Treblinka, who I spent a lot of time with. And over the years, I have always just thought what her last days must have been like. And I think of her very frequently. Michael has named one of his girls after her. Another one he named after my mother. And all three of my children have always been very, very aware of the background. They were not brought up in a religious home at all. My husband was a Mayflower descendant of all things, and not, Protestant, not particularly religious himself. The children all went to Episcopal schools here in Washington. But after the war, my parents would have nothing to do with religion at all. They helped whoever they could of their friends. We tried to find our family, but couldn't. I think if we had, that probably wouldn't have been true. The only thing is my father would light the candles on the Sabbath in memory of his family, and that was it. And I've continued that. But
Yeah.
The grandchildren, if they choose at some point, they've all been aware of their Jewish heritage, and all have, the older ones have all traveled to Poland, to Auschwitz, to Treblinka, but no one is particularly religious in the family at all.
Well, I think it's very difficult to feel that you can express your Jewishness when being Jewish you were victimized, and some people continue to live in a certain kind of way, almost like in hiding of who they are, except that, in your family, everyone was, people who are out in the public eye, so it's a little difficult to be in hiding, so it's
the son who's a elected official has often spoken about his background.
Yes, he speaks about being a child of Holocaust survivors. He's not in hiding about his Jewishness.
My younger
background.
son was the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem for 3 years. And his two boys were in fact born in Jerusalem.
Wow, wow.
And but again, his wife is not Jewish. But all three of them have very much spoken to their children about their background and who they really are. And my oldest granddaughter has just finished a project at Yale for Paul Kennedy about her family and my family and their background as part of a project on biography that she was doing for her symposium.
So she obviously interviewed you for her project.
She did. Mm-hmm. She and my younger son's oldest son, who is a freshman at Columbia, also. I mean, he's not writing about it, but he wanted to know all about it, and they all do. You know, they've all followed up. Even my daughter's, the youngest in the family, who's my daughter's 14-year-old son, has. I remember he went into nursery school with a little Hanukkah lamp that we had and explained it to the rest of his preschool class, what exactly that was, and try to explain his strange background to them. This is in Southern California, where there is not much of a Jewish presence.
Right. Now, you mentioned that James Bennet was the New York correspondent in Jerusalem for a couple of years. Did you go to visit him in Jerusalem?
I did.
And what was that like for you?
It was during the Intifada.
Oh, wow.
And so my son and daughter, their older son had just been born, and that's why I went then. And they wouldn't let me go anywhere because they were so worried that something might happen.
Very scary time.
And it was. And when I left the airport in Tel Aviv, you sort of get a debriefing. And this young man in an army uniform wanted to know why I didn't speak Hebrew or Yiddish. And I tried to explain to him why I didn't. And he was horrified that I had not learned either language. And I said, when I was a child, the last thing you did was speak either.
Exactly. Right. Right. Yeah. That would have been a sure giveaway for sure. Yeah. And did you have any other opportunities to go back to Israel?
No, not after they came here. And we don't have anyone there. And I've considered myself an American all these years. With the Jewish heritage, ethnically Jewish, but not religiously. I really had no interest in traveling or living in Jerusalem, in Israel.
So I understand that while you were there, you did go to Yad Vashem to get some of the people who rescued you honored.
I did. I went to the Polish section and I tried to get the Kucharskis, who had really hidden my father for quite a while after he escaped from the ghetto and who had helped us enormously. He was a conservator at the National Museum before the war. After the war, because he had been in the Polish underground, he ended up in a Soviet prison for a while, but eventually was released. And I went and I asked that they be listed among the people who had.
Yeah, to be a righteous amongst the nations of the world.
But by that time, they had both died. And the person in charge of the Polish section said that they only wanted to honor people who were there and who were still alive and who could come and speak about it.
Well, I think that is absolutely awful. And having myself started the Jewish Foundation for Christian Rescuers, I would like to help you get these individuals honored.
Thank you.
And not only them, but I think your nanny probably ought to be honored as well.
I think the man who got me out of the ghetto and arranged for me to go to the countryside
Yes.
ended, although he was a Catholic and he had served in the Polish army in World War I, ended up at Auschwitz. He always had the number on his arm. He survived, and after the war went to England, where he worked for a British firm, had worked for them before the war as well. And I would very much like to have him also listed.
Yeah, I think that these people need to be absolutely need to be recognized, and so that it becomes part of history. And it's mind-boggling to hear that a professional would say, "We're not going to honor you the people because they're dead." But we will make a difference and make sure that these people are part of history. Now, you mentioned that your did your mother I guess live with you at any point, or did you
No,
live?
no, she always lived independently, and my father lived to be 89, and when he passed away, she continued to live in there. They moved here to Washington in the late 70s, but a house right up the street from me, so I was able to see them every day and to help with whatever needed to be helped. But they preferred to live an independent life. And
So your
as do I.
children also really grew up with their grandparents as well.
They did. They did.
And did your children interview your parents at all about their experiences, or what happened with that?
My parents never talked about it. At one point, when my daughter was in high school, she was taking an ethics course, and she talked to my mother a little bit about the war and what had happened as part of her course, really, in ethics. My mother just didn't want to talk about it. She talked about it a little bit. My father never, ever talked about what had happened during the war. We discovered toward the end of his life, we thought he had Alzheimer's, and he was part of a program at NIH where they did a brain autopsy after you passed away. It was a very small group of Alzheimer's patients. And I had a call from the doctor who asked if my father had been a boxer. And I said, no, he had not been a boxer at all. And he said, the damage in his brain is the kind of Alzheimer's damage that we see from people who have been hit in the head a great deal. CTE, it's called now, and football players are among the people who get it. My father never talked about that. I have no idea when that happened, but it must have happened during the war.
Did he also have headaches? Do you know if he had any headaches after the war?
He did not. My mother had, a great many she would sleep a great deal, especially just after the war. When we were living in Sweden, she slept a great deal. She was very, very depressed, really, until we came to the United States. If my father had headaches, it was something he would never have talked about anyway. So
you wouldn't know. Yeah.
It just wasn't. He just completely shut down. I mean, my mother did say to me a few times that he was so different from the way he had been as a young man.
Well, and I'm sure that his life or death situation for so many years, first the actual escape, and then having to go from place to hide till the war ended was very traumatic. Now, you spoke about Michael, you spoke about James. Tell us a little bit about your daughter, the young one.
My daughter has a business degree and has for many years worked as a consultant. She has two children, a son and a daughter, and lives in California. She is the one who has probably spent the most time involved in trying to find out more about her family and her religion. I think she feels that it's going to be up to the children to decide what they want to do.
That you had mentioned somewhere that I heard that she belonged to a second generation group of Holocaust survivors when she was in New York. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
She was living near Columbia University, and there was a temple down the street from her, 2 blocks down, and she joined a group of Holocaust survivors' children who were there. By that time, she was in her early 20s. And she called me one day and she said, "Mom, they all are talking about their parents exactly the way I think about you and Grandma, Babcha, which is what my mother was always called in the family. You all behave exactly the same way. You always want to know where everybody is. You always want to be sure that everyone is safe." And I think it was actually helpful to her to find out that I wasn't the only one who was somewhat paranoid.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about getting together in groups is to find out that you're not alone, and some things that may seem strange in some way, you find out that indeed they are normal. And there is also an organization, Hidden Child Foundation, that has Holocaust child survivors getting together. Unfortunately, that group is in New York. I think there might be a group in Washington, and maybe at some point you may want to talk to other children who were hidden in the war as well. Although it sounds like you found some people like that from Hunter High School.
Well, none of them had my experience. None of them had. First of all, none of them were. A couple of them were Polish, but had never been in the ghetto. But they were from other parts. But she, I have some really odd quirks. I love dogs and cats, but I cannot stand German shepherds. They terrify me whenever I see them. I've always said to my children, don't buy a house on the corner of a street because you need to be further in so that you can't be seen if you have to leave the house. I mean, these rather odd things that I think are leftovers
Oh,
from what was
absolutely.
instilled in me as a child.
Absolutely. But the incredible thing is that you have been able to overcome the trauma, overcome moving from place to place, learning new languages, and you have a tremendous amount of resilience and joie de vivre, and the fact that you're able to get married, have an incredible family, and have all kinds of interests in a lot of different things, has really helped you overcome your trauma that you experienced. And I think having obviously the fact that your parents survived, and you had parents who themselves were very resilient despite your mother's depression early on, is something that also helped you move on in life and overcome the trauma. And and you did have your parents, the first 2 years of life, you had your parents, which again, you had a lot of love from your parents. Well, not really the first 2 years, it's really the first 4 years of life before
Yeah,
you
no,
escaped the
yeah.
border.
Um, it's I was away from my father, of course, from 42 to 45, my mother 42 to the end of 43. But I was with a nanny. It was all as my mother kept saying, my mother would never talk about the past because she said you really have to only think of the future. And I would try to, that's one reason that I never did find out very much about my family, because she wouldn't talk about it because she said it's gone. They're all gone. There is just no point in talking about it. She would never, she never went to anyone's funeral, any friend. She just drew a veil over her whole past. And I'm not sure that that's actually a very healthy thing to have done. And and the children have all tried to find out more. Um, I found what I think are some cousins in the south of France because they have my mother's uh, my maternal grandmother's maiden name, which is a very odd Lithuanian name. And my mother never wanted me to contact them. Um, it was all over for her. It was just, she just did not ever want to think about what had happened. And my children certainly try to get them to tell them. And now one of my granddaughters has certainly tried. I don't know which is healthier, to actually work through it all or to just forget everything. I think working through it all is much better because you don't want these things to happen again. And you need to be there to tell people about it. I mean, look at what's happening today, where Russia is again attacking Eastern Europe. And we're going to have refugees streaming over the border into Poland.
Yes, we are.
It's sort of ironic that it's happening today as I'm talking to you about.
Yes, it sure is. Yeah.
What happened to me.
Yeah. So I hope that you don't watch television to be reminded of some of the scenes that you saw of, dead people all around, hungry people, because you need to be there for your children, for your grandchildren, and let's hope that it will not be a war that kills too many people and that doesn't last too long.
As I've moved into my 80s, and I have college classmates who have, 3 of them have died in the last few weeks, and friends are dying, friends' husbands. And someone talked to me about this the other day, and I said, look, my whole life has been a gift. I shouldn't be here at all. So I don't have any fear of, what happens when you're 80 in your 80s and maybe death is hovering over you. Because my parents and I had all of those years that were just pure chance that we got them. Pure luck that we were the ones who did survive when others didn't.
Well, it was definitely pure chance, but I think that we can't remember the righteous amongst the nations, the non-Jewish rescuers that are also responsible for your being here, and the fact that your parents had such great relationships with all these non-Jewish people before the war, and they indeed felt indebted to to you to risk their lives to ensure that you survive genocide.
That was part, of course, of being, an educated city dwellers. If you came from the little villages and so forth, you were all pushed into the ghettos. You were the people who died first because you had no connections,
Right.
and there were so few people to help.
That's why on a broader scale today, when we think about anti-Semitism in America, what we Jews need to think about as a community is we need to build alliances with other groups of people in order not to feel so alone in being persecuted as Jews, and that very often if a group of people begins discrimination and dehumanization against another group of people, they will ultimately be responsible for the same discrimination, dehumanization of other groups of people who are different from them.
That's absolutely true. I saw that there have been a lot of anti-Semitic flyers
Hey,
in
let
several
me
cities in
let me jump
Texas in
in
the
real
last few
quick.
weeks.
Let me get you to say that again, so I
I'm
can
sorry,
cut that.
that's my
So,
coughing.
yeah, no, it's okay. Also,
Um,
we're running a little over. We're already about an hour and 6 minutes, so we do need to kind of wrap it up here. But let's go ahead and finish what you were going to say there. I just want to, get
And if I just can jump in for a second, I know you mentioned, earlier on about what's happening today and how it's bringing back memories for you. Is it possible you could just say a line about, what it brings back in terms of the Holocaust?
all right. I'm sorry, this is left over from a lot of chemo. Coughing. I just read that there are anti-Semitic leaflets being spread over several cities in Texas in the last few days, actually. And I've spoken to several friends from South America recently, who of course have been, in the last few years, as a volunteer, I've taught English as a second language, mostly to Hispanic adults in a volunteer program for many, many years, trying to do something, that I can actually manage to do in the immigrant community. And in the last few years, of course, they have been made to feel unwelcome and demonized. Not to the extent that the Jews were, of course, but still. And so have their children in schools. And this is it just never ends. This is the thing that's so incredible to me. It was so incredible watching, and I shouldn't have been watching the Bosnian War. And you're right, I probably should not watch what's going to happen next in Ukraine. But the idea that you again have don't mean to use the word madman, but someone who wants to bring back the glories of the past to his country and is willing to do it through invasion and war is just, it's as if we never learn.
I'm thinking of all the Holocaust survivors who are still in the Ukraine, and their children who now, will have to go through another war.
Yeah. Well, the president of Ukraine is Jewish.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Putin was saying the other day is he wants to do the denazification of Ukraine. I mean, it's just absolutely no sense, these excuses that are used by
Well,
those
he
who hold
uses any
power.
kind of excuses to expand Russia and to live out his grandiose ideas of beginning to conquer little by little different parts of Europe.
My hope is that Poland and Ukraine, both are countries that have actually had periods of independence and periods when they've been subjugated by the Russians. But Ukraine, like Poland, at least had some history of democracy being there. And that's my only hope for America, is the fact that we do have that several hundred years of democracy here, and that we're going to be willing to fight to keep it.
On that optimistic note, I want to thank you very much, Suzanne,
Thank you,
for
Dr. Fogelman.
allowing me to interview you, and that other people watching this, listening to this, have a lot to learn from you about overcoming trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Fogelman, for your insight and your thoughtful questions. Suzanne, we are so grateful to have had you here with us today. What came up for me was how vivid your memories are and what an incredible life journey you have had. I was also very interested to hear about your parents and that your father did not discuss the war. Working firsthand with Holocaust survivors, we understand how difficult it is to retell these painful memories. It is also common for survivors not to discuss their experience. So thank you for your courage in sharing and documenting your story. We are inspired by you. That's all the time we have today on the Blue Card podcast, Stories of the Holocaust, Overcoming Historical Trauma. We look forward to seeing you next time.